Okay, good morning. Let us pray. Almighty God, you alone can bring into order the unruly wills and affection of sinners. Grant your people grace to love what you command and desire what you promise, that among the swift and varied changes of the world, our hearts may surely there be fixed where true joys are to be found. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. So, did you want to say anything to get us started, or we're good?
I think we're good. Real quick, for those of you who haven't met Pam, Pam is newish, so I want to.
I'm Pam 3, not to be confused with Pam 1.
So welcome. It's good to have her here. Also roaming around campus somewhere is Beryl Kinney, whom some of you will remember, our former seminarian, who has since gotten into chaplaincy work. She's been working at hospitals and at hospice for a while now. And so be sure and say hello to Beryl when you see her. She is being ordained 1 week from yesterday. So this coming Saturday, I believe, is going to be her ordination service. So that's exciting for her as well. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're ready to jump in. So we want to first look back at where we are in the story. So if you look up there, we've got our little icon for that last week. So can somebody tell us about where are we at this point?
Just a brief summary of last week.
Well, 2 weeks ago, but
Yeah. All right, 2 weeks ago. Yes.
Israel wanting a king instead of God being their king.
and so the people ended up with good old Saul. So what can we say about Saul? What was he?
He seemed to have gotten his position because he was a good-looking guy. Tall, so forth. And he needed to be successful for a while, and he said, until he kind of fell off the rails and decided to do something.
Do you remember specifically what he did that caused him to lose that favor with God?
Well, he jumped the gun and he didn't, being very type A, he didn't want to wait for Samuel to make it in 7 days. And so he offered a sacrifice, and that wasn't his role. And God said, I'm not going to be with you anymore. And I always thought Saul kind of got maybe the wrong end of the history deal. He probably wasn't as terrible as Samuel made him out to be. If Samuel wrote this thing, I've always thought this thing was kind of a tragedy in 3 acts. And I mean, the story is probably a little bit like Macbeth, and it even has a wonderful witch at the end of it. So,
The Witch of Endor. Okay, so that brings us to this week. So what's happening in our story this week? How does it open?
David's introduced.
Right, but what is the first thing that brings him to our attention?
Deteriorating.
And David he left his flocks and he went to take his brother something to eat, and they were ready to fight the Philistines. And he heard Goliath going through his little spiel about, send somebody over here, I'll fight them. If y'all win, then we'll be your servants. If we win, we'll be your servants. If y'all win, well, you know what I mean. If Philistines win, they'll be the servants of the Israelites, and if the Israelites win, then the Philistines be the servants of the Israelites. And David waited to see who was gonna volunteer. Saul didn't have anybody volunteer, and so David said, "I'll do it." And everybody said, "You can't, you're just a kid. You're ready and you're handsome. So you can't do it." He said, "I have the armor of the Lord on me." And they tried to put armor on David, and he was so little, he couldn't move with the armor on him. So he took it all off, got his little sling with his 5 rocks, and went over and stood before Goliath, and Goliath was going, "You gotta be kidding me." And so David swung his sling and hit him right between, in the forehead, and the rock sank in his forehead, and it says in here it killed him. But then David took, Goliath's sword and cut his head off and killed him. So I don't know which one killed him.
Well, we know
First one knocked him out, and the other one, that sword, that was one of the new things I learned about the whole David and Goliath thing, because I always thought it was just a stone that. Everything else.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. That's how it began.
All right. Good job, Sharon.
Thank you.
So there's going along with that story, I recently heard a little explanation of that. How could he have done that? And in ancient history, the archers were the sort of the elite of the fighting people. Also had people that could use slings and stones as a part of their armament. And for those of you that have a little bit of technology thinking, the energy in a bullet, the ballistics of a bullet, is a combination of the velocity and the mass, the two together. And so if you take a stone and a sling, which is an extension of the arm, like about 3 feet, and you turn it round and round, you get huge velocity off of it. So the velocity in the stone, and he hit him exactly the only place he was not defended, right in the forehead, because his shield was not there. So you can add that to your portfolio of knowledge.
Done.
But to me, if you knocked him out and he cut off his head, or killed him and cut off his head, it doesn't make any difference.
Yeah,
Because he won the battle and he was a hero
yeah.
and still is.
I think it's interesting also, you mentioned technology. We've got kind of the 3 prehistoric technological ages mentioned in the story. Bronze, iron, and stone. And so this is probably right around the transition period between the Bronze and the Iron Age. But we're told specifically that Goliath had bronze and iron. And David prevailed over him with stone. A couple thousand years earlier.
Thanks be to God.
Inferior technology.
Well, the other thing, and Rod and I were talking a little bit, is sometimes a person that's the unassuming type person, the smaller person, or the less well-known, actually has an advantage. And Goliath, I'm sure, doesn't pay any attention to him, and David just knocked him in the head.
Didn't even see him as a threat.
No, didn't see him as a threat. So that's a good message for us.
I imagine David had a lot of practice, probably killing coyotes and wolves.
He should. Lions, tigers, wolves.
Yeah.
One of my favorite parts of the story, and I'm gonna go ahead and share it, is that it's on page 135, you got the book. When at the beginning of the confrontation between Goliath and David, the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth, so that the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." I just love that passage.
There's a great, in that Lenten book we've been using, great description of the difference between faith and belief. The
Mhm.
guy talks about his son who jumps out of airplanes with parachutes and has to calculate velocity and all this stuff. And that the author believes that the parachute is going to open, but the son who's jumping out of airplanes has faith that the parachute is going to open. So David has faith that he is going to, that God is going to deliver him. That's, most of us might believe that God is going to deliver us, but you know, I don't know if I'd want to go take on a 9-foot guy with a.
Really?
Well, the book doesn't really bring up the rewards that this person was going to get, but I mean, if you read Samuel, he's going to get his daughter and his wife and a bunch of money, and his family would never have to pay taxes again. And he knew all that before he went out there. So I have trouble with, I mean, I think he believed certainly in God and what he said, but I couldn't help think maybe there was a little something else in his mind about being married to the king's daughter.
Which ultimately is going to give him a claim to the kingship.
It seemed to me just beating Goliath that will result in a little portion of 5,000 shekels. So that's not, around that.
But the title for this week's chapter is "A Man After God's Own Heart," and it's like, how can he be a man after God's own heart? There's stuff in his story that really makes me question that. And so I did a little research on that. And this first story, I think, really gives us a hint about what it is that makes David a man after God's own heart. One of the things that makes him a man after God's own heart. And that is that unwavering faith, that he had no doubt that God was going to give the Goliath into David's hand. He just did it because God was with him. And that unwavering faith in the face of a giant. So what else? Where does this story go from there?
I was gonna say one thing, he came with experience. Otherwise, David had encounters with God and, with the bear and the lion and I think he had a strong faith and something that he had it wasn't just, this wasn't his first rodeo, you might say. I mean, it was a bigger rodeo, but he'd been to smaller rodeos before that. So. Yeah, that's all I want to say.
So what you're saying, Lee, is what I'm hearing is that he was prepared.
He was prepared.
He didn't just show up and there's a 9-foot giant throwing insults.
No,
He practiced.
he had practiced and he had steadily got more confidence and more faith in the Lord and experience hearing from God and loving God too. But I think he was prepared.
Well, has anybody ever seen a taxidermy real mountain lion?
Yep.
Mhm.
Okay, so they're longer than this table, right? And he's like grabbing by the jaw. Can you imagine that fearless gall it takes to grab this toothy, and their, you know, their claws are this long, and not my sheep, you know, breaks his neck or whatever. But one, he had to have physical strength, but just the courage it takes to grab a live animal with fangs that could murder you in just a swipe of the paw. And then there's a bear. Has anybody ever flown into Anchorage Airport? Yeah, okay, so they had these taxidermy bears. I haven't seen one up close. I have seen bears in person, but their paws are this big, and then their claws go on like this. And the length of my arm, or my arm, is the size of one of their paws. That's just the paw. Of course, it depends on the size of the bear, but that's what David's up against. So I don't think that's why he felt such fear when he saw Goliath. Maybe. Just another big old bear.
They say that the average Israeli was about 5'3", and they think that Saul was around 6 feet tall. And then in the Masorite text, the Jewish Hebrew text, it says that Goliath at 6 cubits was about 9 feet 9 inches. Josephus, and in the Quran, the XXL. Anyway, it says that he's about 6'7". And if you do, I have another note about Moses' calculations. I guess the different ways they calculated a cubit. He was at 7 feet 9 inches. So he was bigger than Saul, and Saul was bigger than David. So Saul probably looked better in comparison. Like Saul really should have been able to handle it, but why is this little kid, this 5'3" Tom Cruise guy? How is he gonna do it?
But don't you think it just means he was a big guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, Goliath.
And the other question for me is, when David first laid his eyes on him, what went through his mind? Did he say, "Oh my goodness, what am I doing here?" Because that's a big guy, and he's got armor, and he's got swords. Be a scary thing.
I don't think he was bothered by that at all.
Who is this uncircumcised Philistine
Yeah.
that he should defy the armies of the living God? It's pretty gutsy for a little guy.
Yeah.
Really? It reminds me a lot of yesterday. I went to watch Kansas. Sorry to throw that in.
Was the smackdown.
But I think the thing is, of that, it was the faith in him. All those other things were, physical things, but he had so much faith that I can handle it. I mean, have you ever known anyone that, I think we're all faithful, but someone that truly believes 100% that God will take care of them through illness, all kinds of family problems, and all, that they have faith. And if they have faith in God, and that's it, period, that can solve everything. And Bob and I have a family and friends like that. We don't agree with them on some parts of the Bible, but in everything that they have been through, that is exactly what they go back to, their faith in God.
And confidence goes a long way as well.
Right.
My wife has gotten really into boxing. And, a lot of these boxers, there's a lot of bravado and, psyching the other person out. But if you don't believe you're going to beat that other person up, you're going to get your butt kicked.
Right.
You've got to have confidence in yourself. And David clearly does.
Absolutely.
But that did come in part from experience and preparation. But he'd been in a way training for this for a long time. And yesterday, I participated in a writing workshop, and our topic was luck. And we had a whole bunch of quotes. And one of the really great quote that I took away from it was that luck is the confluence of preparation and opportunity. And yeah, it wasn't luck, it was preparation and opportunity here that opened this door. Okay. So,
There was a lot of tension between David and Saul after David did what he did and was able to beat the Palestinians with the army, with Saul's army. And Saul was so concerned that he wanted David killed, but David had the friend, Saul's son Jonathan, who went to his father and entreated him not to do that. The father, Saul, was really distressed when Samuel died, and he wanted to get in touch with him. And so he went to a medium, and shortly after that, there was a terrible battle with the Philistines, and Saul and his son Jonathan were in the battle, and both were killed. You want me to go on? Or?
sure.
So finally, Israel was unified under David as a king. I kind of skipped over some of it with the sons of Saul, but and David pleases all the people when he brings the ark to Jerusalem. So I want to stop here.
I sort of wanted to comment about some of the irony that you always find in these things. For example, there was a gospel that was saving David. They were doing a deal one. They turned around, probably because they were still battling the Philistines, and Jonathan, his friend, along with Saul, got killed in this battle, and it's like ironic. And then there's this whole thing with OSCC.
Yes.
You know, to communicate with the dead and picking around the table holding hands or something like that. And alcohol. Yeah, Ouija board, yeah. There's a certain amount of irony in that whole episode.
There's a wonderful funeral oration at the beginning of the second book of Samuel, where David is very sincere about the loss and talks about how have the mighty fallen. And that's a pivotal moment of summarizing his sense. I think David had the chance to kill Saul on 2 or 3 occasions, and he never did because he believed sincerely that you couldn't kill an anointed king of God. And I think that's really significant. That's why David scared Saul on a couple of occasions, but didn't go through it. But I go to all the musical backgrounds and everything, and Handel wrote a wonderful oratorio called Saul. And he took this tragedy in 3 acts, I don't know, 1733, I think. But the last piece of music that came out of that is a wonderful funeral march. And that's been used in many, many state funerals. And it was played at George Washington's funeral in this country and Abraham Lincoln's funeral. So it's a very significant piece of music. And so I think David had conflict all the time of his battles with Saul, but in the end, he did sincerely grieve over the loss. And then the friendship with Jonathan. I said the ironic thing in this whole story, we've been talking about all these significant women and all the judges' story, and you get to Saul, and there's no mention of the wife. But somebody had to raise Jonathan and his daughter and get the values passed from a parent to a child. But the missing element in this story is a woman. And Saul have a significant woman. For every great man, there's gotta be a woman pushing him to do the right thing.
Now, let me jump in because this is something that irritates me. There is a woman in the story, significant one. And we don't pay her any attention, and they've kind of written her out here as well, and that's Michal.
Oh, yeah.
So they
Mhm.
say that Saul's son saved David's life. Saul's daughter,
Mhm.
Michal, also saved David's life. They don't make any mention of that.
Mhm.
They portray her as this kind of shrewish, bitter woman who's, giving David a hard time for dancing. And they don't talk about all the things that she went through. That, Saul tried to get her to betray David. Then when she didn't, he married her off to someone else. And then when Saul died, he took her back. She was just a pawn. She was unable to bear children, and here's David with, a gazillion wives and concubines, having all these kids, and we can imagine how she was treated. So this is one of the few women in the Old Testament, I think, that we really know quite a bit about, and we don't pay her any attention, and we treat her as if, she was just this mean-spirited woman.
Well, it says originally that she loved him. I mean,
Oh, yeah, that's right.
That's what it said originally.
There's that image, it comes up over and over and over. Whoever put this together takes these images and weaves them through all these stories, but saving David by lowering it out of the window on a rope. I mean, that comes up over and over. Rahab did that with the spies. Paul was saved by somebody. So, I mean, that device is there. I mean, she loved David initially, and then she got, like you said, a chess pawn in this chess game, and in the end, she hated his guts. So it's.
I think she was afraid of her father too, because she lied to her father and told her that David had threatened to, that she did it because she was threatened.
But I think you make a great point. There's more written about her than there is about that. Detail, right?
The narrative that they wanted to get across.
Yeah, and I think that this book buys into what I consider a false narrative. They say that, even David wasn't perfect. I'm like, wasn't perfect? He sexually assaulted a woman and murdered her husband. Oh, he just they call it like a misstep or something. There's a heck of a misstep.
John the Baptist deal too, wasn't a blow in the right direction for David.
Mhm.
Plus David had so many wives, that was against the law. And he was still a man after God's own heart. I didn't understand that.
I don't think it was against the law at the time.
Well, in the Old Testament though, back when Moses was going over you're not gonna do this and you're not gonna do that, and he said
Oh.
you're not gonna
Multiply
Multiply
wives.
wives.
Multiply wives was
Hmm.
one of the things, if you were gonna be a king and stuff like that, you weren't supposed to, or chariots and horses, because you were. Anyway. So.
That
Regardless
just
of the law,
confused me.
multiple wives.
And then he got married again. On top of all those wives.
And the other thing they said, according to the law, when David took Uriah's wife, and possibly raped her, we don't really know, that could have been a sentence of death or stoning or whatever for that. Now, some people say that I read that when they go to war, that they would divorce their wives, and that was a custom. Now, it doesn't really say that in here. It calls Bathsheba Uriah's wife. So God tells him, I guess it would have been through Nathan, I guess, wasn't it? That he wasn't going to die, but the child was going to die.
And I did print out a few things, and this is Michelangelo's David, and this is really an idealized form. And that's one of the things that makes this so beautiful is the proportions are perfect. And so that's kind of how David's he's over and over again that he's the ideal. He's the man after God's own heart. But this is not reality. I mean, he is, again, he is called a man after God's own heart, but he was far from perfect. And then I printed these out too. I'll go ahead and pass these around.
Yeah.
Some other famous art illustrations of David and Goliath, because it's probably one of the stories that is really well known. Even kids know that story. So David brings the ark to Jerusalem. And then he has an encounter with Bathsheba. And then what? So what are the consequences after that? When he
Well, it made God mad.
the consequences of his interaction with Bathsheba. What?
Could we step back just a little bit about, where David felt like he needed to build a permanent building
Oh, yeah.
for the ark? But I think that's an important thing, it'd be, the ark could be drug all over the country through tents and this, that, and the other. And David feels like he needs to build a permanent cedar house for him, for the ark. But God said, if I read this correctly, he said, no, that'll be for someone else to do. Namely Solomon. And I think that's a foretelling of an important part of this story down through Solomon, rather.
And he told David that he never asked him to do that. He never commanded him.
Actually, the cedar house would have been pretty nice. But not as nice as Solomon's temple.
But even Solomon, when he dedicated, said that God wasn't going to live in it. It wasn't going to, which I thought was, I mean, we know who ultimately builds the temple, which is Christ.
I don't understand the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah. God struck him there, and because he reached out his hand to the ark, and he died there beside the ark of God. I don't want that make any sense to me.
We either did David because David was mad about it.
I kind of took it, he stumbled and he reached out.
Yeah.
But wasn't it that only a priest was allowed to touch the ark? And this guy hasn't been consecrated as a priest, and he's doing it either to stop the ark from falling or because he stumbled. And so it really wasn't, I don't think, an intentional slight against against the ark, but he drops dead. That seemed kind of harsh to me.
And after that, David was afraid to bring the ark home, so he takes it to somebody else's house to see how it goes first, because it really freaked him out.
Then comes the story about the little lamb that was a pet and drank after his master and ate with his master, and this little lamb was everything to that man.
You could relate to that.
Yeah,
With
it
your
made me
goats.
want to cry.
With your goats. I thought about you when I read that.
Made me go out and have to like a goat.
Yeah, that's the story that Nathan tells, right?
Yeah. And the rich man didn't want to kill any of his many animals to feed this guy that came in, and so he took that lamb and killed him, fed him to that guy, and that made David really mad.
Just hearing the story.
Yeah. He said, the man who did that needs to die.
I was amazed that there was a story like that. It's so similar to parables in the New Testament.
Mhm.
Question I have is, that's definitely a parable.
Yes,
Yeah.
Is that
it
the
is.
first parable in the whole collection of them? In any of, were there any stories like that that were used as a parable to illustrate a important point earlier in the Old Testament?
You know,
I've always said this is the first one, and I may be totally out in left field, but
well, I read Psalm 78 the other day, and it starts out that I'm gonna tell you a parable.
Yes.
And that's the verse that they quote in the New Testament for Christ speaking in parables.
Yeah.
And then you read the story that he tells, you know, it's all about coming out of Egypt. So,
Lee brought up an important point. Psalm 78 is the best cliff note for everything that we've read up to this point. It just goes through the whole history of the Old Testament, everything. It's just the most wonderful. And it has the last paragraph of it, the last few lines talks about David,
about David, yeah.
and he sums David up in about, whoever wrote it did a beautiful job. So.
I'm not a language person per se, but I'd like to know the difference between a parable and a fable. As it makes some fables, because they always have a lesson attached to some little story that there's something, well, you know, like a fox and the whatever, tortoise and the hare or whatever. And they're all like lessons. And that's what a parable is. It's kind of a situation or a story to get across some sort of. I'm just wondering if we talk about which was the first. Before there was a lot of written stuff, there was a lot of just oral history. And singing a song was one way of passing on that oral history.
Yeah, and that's a tricky question, especially when you're dealing with different languages that are being translated into other languages. The word in the Old Testament in Hebrew that we translate as parable is mashal, which really carries a very different meaning from the Greek word parable in a sense. So it's a difficult translation issue. But I think that what you're describing as a fable, stories that reveal some sort of cultural wisdom, I think has been found probably in every culture for the past 100,000 years, I guess.
And just a quick answer here. I just Googled it. Like fable, the parable also tells a simple story, but whereas fables tend to personify animal characters, often giving the same impression as does an animated cartoon. The typical parable uses human agents. And that's what I remember from literature classes, that a fable uses animals to tell the story, and a parable, it's human interactions.
Oh, we all learned something.
So where are we at now?
Nathan's telling David stuff that the Lord told him to tell him. You're the man. On page 143.
Mhm.
Yeah, really, this is just about the only part of this whole covenant story that I really like. Just the genius of Nathan, the way that God sort of tend to think of Saul as a villain and David as a hero. I tend to think of Saul as more of a sympathetic character, kind of a tragic character. And this isn't fair either, but I tend to think of David as a police hero. He was really kind of a bad dude. So I guess I like seeing him get his comeuppance in such a brilliant fashion where he convicts himself.
And to me, one of the interesting things, you brought the art with us, and I looked for some art for this story, but Wilson can hear. I think, like, if artists are gonna portray pictures, like, you're the man as the mom, I mean, I would think it'd be all over the place, but it's not. I find that interesting. It's almost like, we all think so highly of David. It's kind of in our psyche that artists aren't really portraying it like they are the Goliath story and is that your experience, Wilson?
Yeah,
Not being able to find that?
I've always been kind of, we're at this pivot point, and David's story becomes the catalyst for so many artistic things, especially sculpture. If you go to Florence and you see the David in the Academy, it's not the one out in front of the city hall. They moved him inside so that the bad air doesn't deteriorate him. And you go to the Bargello, the museum, and there's this little statue that Donatello did of this very effeminate kid in bronze. And I mean, that's probably the one more like the real story, but there's just so many images of David as a hero. And it's kind of, when you get to this point, it becomes a catalyst for a whole lot of Western civilization and the art that happened with it. I had the great privilege of going to Rome and seeing in 2000, or in, I guess it was 2005, and went to the Borghese Gallery and saw Bernini's statue of David. And I don't know, it was a gift from the Holy Spirit because I had that whole room to myself for 45 minutes with no people. And you could, but that sculpture of David, you see the intensity of looking at him, and I think it really conveys, but you get this awe of how did they do that out of this piece of stone? It was Michelangelo always said he could chisel it because he knew exactly how it was going to come out of the rock. But I don't know. This man is spun from all these positive things, and he was really kind of a jerk in terms of how he talk about the theme of raising rotten kids. It just is a thread that goes through this. You had Eli and his kids that were rotten. Samuel didn't do a much better job of it because his two kids were rotten. And then you come to David, and oh my goodness, his kids, one of his sons rapes his daughter, and David sweeps it under the rug, and there's no consequences for that. Then Absalom comes along and steals his throne and almost gets away with it. And David didn't want the kid disciplined at all and was really angry when his general puts a sword in him. I mean, he just, he didn't walk his talk very well. And he got caught in many of the circumstances, but I don't know. I don't know. You kind of shake your head. Everybody thinks David was his hero, and I don't think he was. He was probably the one that had to pull all of this together, but on the other hand, I don't know, I guess you just have to say God has some bigger plan for all of this, and he doesn't make decisions the way we do. And I think his saying David is the one that's going to pull this off, and obviously it goes all the way down the line to Jesus, and somehow there's a thread there that is very important.
All of David's wives except for Bathsheba, he had only one child with each one male anyway, they don't know, but one male with each one. And then, of course, with Bathsheba, he had four. So you kind of get him going, oh, here's a new wife, okay, I have a kid, and then he goes on to the next one. And really there's no family there. you
This is
know?
not gonna end well. I mean, this is, yeah.
No, he's
There's
and
no
then these
good
kids,
outcome here.
and with that, with, who was it? The one with the long hair,
Absolutely.
yeah, Absalom, you know, he went on, his rebellion against David went on for years. You know, he stood out in front of the gate and told people that he wanted to be a judge, you know, and nobody's in there can help you, but I can help you, and that went on for he bought a fancy chariot and drove around town. He was like running for office, you know, and then he got a whole bunch of people on his side and really started a coup. And all this time, you know, David's doing nothing about it, you know, just letting him do whatever he wants. And he was next in line to be king as far as he was concerned. He was supposed to be the next king.
I think we have to be careful about using artwork to portray character, because there's an awful lot of artistic license in this. Going to Rome, one of the things I saw was a Michelangelo statue of Moses where he used to have horns.
Those are rays of light. That's, you know, his face shines. Remember?
That's
That's-
right.
They look just like horns,
Yeah,
but
that's what
they're,
I'm saying, they appear to be, so, you
Yeah.
know, it's like,
but they didn't know how else to get that shiny.
And with art, there was these two also that was included in our little guide that, and this is Nathan condemning David, two depictions of that. So I'll go ahead and pass that around too. So it wasn't always just the good stuff and all the heroic moments, because he was a terrible father. He was a terrible husband.
So the things that strike me is that we talked about Saul's daughter getting short shrift. Nathan gets short shrift in this story, I think, because he's a hero. To me, he's the hero. And David is held up by Jewish tradition as the hero. And like you said, he paid to pull it all together, but his relationship with Bathsheba was bad. But the traitorous thing he did was to get Uzziah killed. And that story is glossed over. You know the story of Bathsheba, but nobody ever talks about her husband getting put in front of the soldiers and getting killed, which to me is horrible. So David had his own problem.
But isn't that one of the reasons why God said that David was not allowed to build the temple, because he had innocent blood on his hands? I mean, he was a warrior and he had killed a lot of people, but that one incident, that was innocent blood that was shed at David's command, really.
So in history, David's a winner and Saul's a loser. Who are you gonna write about?
That's true. That's the way history works.
Solomon really was, you know, you talk about these heirs and the spare book that's going around with Prince Harry, but Solomon was actually 16th in line for the throne, so that wasn't a done deal at the beginning, so.
Well, I was thinking, you was talking about modern culture, and I was thinking about the similarity between this story about David and Yellowstone, because it just sets the stage for Yellowstone.
That's where it came from.
One of the reference books that I'm using refers to this period in Jewish history as the Golden Age. You know, Saul, David, Solomon, it doesn't get any better than this. I'm thinking, boy,
And this is the height of their power and influence, probably as a culture, is during this Davidic period. And so I think that it's natural for the Jewish people to look back at this as the golden age, in the same way that people in England look back at the height of the British Empire as like, this was when England was really great. Well, actually, England was not so great. This was not their best period, but it's what they're always going to look back to. It's kind of the golden And so I think that when Jesus is then portrayed as in the lineage of David, it may be that there's intended to be some irony there, because he is going to show that greatness doesn't look like what we think greatness does.
So when I went and did a little search on, again, why is David called a man after God's own heart? And he's only, that terminology, a man after God's own heart, is only used twice in the Bible. And the first time is there in 1 Samuel, 1 Samuel 13:14, and then in Acts, when they're telling the story about David, again, that they say that he was a man after God's own heart. But what I found when I was reading, trying to answer this question, how can he be a man after God's own heart, was that if you read the Psalms, particularly the Davidic Psalms, that you get a portrait of him as a whole, more of a whole person. And I don't know if I agree with all of this, but the words that they came up to describe him were that he is humble, reverent, respectful, trusting. He always trusts in the Lord. Loving, well, but he does love the Lord, and that's clear through all of the Psalms, that he truly loves the Lord. He's devoted, he's faithful, he's obedient, and he's repentant. And that was one of the things I think that really stood out in my mind as the difference between Saul and David, is that David, when he is confronted, is truly repentant, where when Saul was confronted, he made excuses. Well, the people were leaving, and you didn't get here, and and made excuses for his actions, where David was truly remorseful and truly repentant, I think.
He also had a sense of justice too. You could see that in some of the decisions he made.
I think that the Psalms also reveal a person who has this kind of almost personal relationship with God. Reminds me a little bit of Moses. It's just like God is his buddy that he's having these conversations with, and the sense that God is always present with him. And this whole what happens with Bathsheba and Uriah, this is somebody who has forgotten that God is right there watching, thinks he can get away with something. But at his best, David knows that God is there all the time. There's an important lesson there. None of us can get away with anything.
That was at the height of when the whole kingdom was together, and he kind of maybe kicked back a little bit and got too confident in his own abilities at that point.
Yeah, the boy David puts his trust in God to defend him. The King David puts his trust in himself.
I think so. I think for a while there, I think that was the case.
So is there anything in this story that you don't remember hearing before? Something that was new in your, in
I wasn't aware that all that armor for Goliath was bronze. That surprised me. I don't know what I thought it was, but that surprised me. It seemed like that would be darn heavy.
I think the point you made about God not allowing him to build the home house for the ark was new to me. Why he did, I mean, that he had a reason for not letting him build.
and with that weight of his armor, well, just his coat of mail, I did a little arithmetic to figure out how much just that coat of mail and 5,000 shekels comes out to about 104 pounds. And that's just his coat of mail. That's not all the other
That's not
armor.
all the other armor.
And he's walking around like that, like that's a t-shirt.
David's armor was much more effective.
Well, some of these modern age NFL players could almost are that big and they wear that kind of armor.
It's not bronze.
No, but they're armored up.
Time to wrap things up.
Good chapter.
Yes. Do we have a closing prayer? If we do. Or not?
We don't usually have a.
Oh,
closing
okay.
argument. Doesn't mean we can't have one.
Anti-prayer.
Sorry, I didn't mean to imply that. Meant
I
when-
don't know where you got this.
Oh, I'm sure I'll put that.
The one thing about this that I love with the David story, music becomes a really important part of this story, and playing the harp for Saul and solving some of the, and when they bring the ark into Jerusalem, I mean, there's singing and dancing and lots of beautiful noise, and I mean, the music becomes a really important part of this story, and that's what I love about it, so.
And one of the things that I take away at the end of all this is that the David was not perfect. David was far from perfect. And still he's called a man after God's own heart. And so that's not the goal, to live a perfect life and to never make a mistake. That's ridiculous anyway. That's never going to happen. But even David, with all his faults and all of his missteps, if you want to call it that, is still a man after God's own heart.
For next week, we're gonna talk about Solomon. And in addition to this chapter in the path, Kim is inviting y'all to read the Song of Solomon. It's a short book in the Old Testament. And if you can't read the whole thing, which is not really long, but if you can't read the whole thing, read chapter 8. Love story, oh yeah. Good love story.
Awesome.
Thank y'all so much.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Good job.
It's all that EFM training.
It's all of you. That's what makes the class, everybody in it.
Hair.
People talk.
That's what happens. That's what-
Great job.